Welcome to Teaching Truth. In his excellent book, and as a preface to it, the famous late Lord Denning wrote these words. In the end, I decided to tell of some of those great cases of the past which have gone to make our Constitution. They are cases of which students of history and of law ought to know much, but of which they know little or nothing. At most, they only have a nodding acquaintance. They are cases too which are full of interest for others. They portray dramatic situations. The characters are real, the scenes are true, the prose is good. The decisions have had lasting consequences. Words that could well have been attributed by Lord Denning to the trial of the Apostle Paul. A case, if ever there was one, of which we, as we study the Bible as followers of Jesus Christ, ought to know much, but of perhaps we maybe only have a nodding acquaintance with. The case portrays dramatic situations. The characters in the case, in the trial of Paul, are real. The scenes are true, and the prose that we find in Acts 21 through to Acts 27 is good. And the decisions too have lasting consequences. If ever there was a landmark case in the early church that made its way, as it were, from the sheriff court to the high court, the court of session, all the way to the Supreme Court of the day, it would be the trial of the Apostle Paul. By then, one of the great and emerging leaders of the early church. In every way, it was a landmark case, a landmark in the law of the day. One which, if the late Lord Denning had been around in the first century, he would have undoubtedly added to his book, Landmarks in the Law. In our reflections today, as we look at the trial of Paul, which spans 5 chapters in the action-packed book of Acts, we want to consider, first of all, the falsifications that had been brought against Paul, which led to his trial. By way of sketching in the background for you, Paul was under arrest in Jerusalem because of false accusations which had been made by the Jews. Paul's Roman citizenship demanded a fair hearing, so the commander in charge set up a meeting with the Jewish priests and the Sanhedrin. And that meeting ended in chaos and with Paul back in protective custody. Paul's young nephew, as we'll discover in our reflections tomorrow, overheard some of the Jews plotting to kill Paul. So Paul asked him to tell the commander. And the commander had no choice but to arrange a large military escort to take the Apostle Paul to the city of Caesarea, the nearest headquarters of Roman rule. And one night, in the flurry of all these events, Jesus appeared to Paul and told him to be of good courage, because he would be going all the way to Rome, all the way to the Supreme Court in London, as it were, to testify about his faith. In the years since Paul had become a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, he had devoted his life to the gospel and to the preaching of it. He taught both Jews and he also taught Gentiles. He had a relationship, as we thought a couple of weeks ago, with one of the leading and emerging churches of the day, the Antioch church, from which he was propelled into 3 missionary journeys. He had taken the good news of Jesus through Asia Minor and over to Macedonia across the Mediterranean. He was warned that he would find persecution and arrest, but nonetheless, Paul was open to and followed the leading and the prompting of the Holy Spirit. And so because of what Paul was doing, there was high tension among the Jews in Jerusalem. There was much debate. News had got around. Many Jews had accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but others had not. And therefore, some Jews falsely accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the Jewish temple and thereby defiling, by that action, the temple. Now, Paul had not done this, but an angry mob, well, they beat him. And the riot that ensued drew the attention of the Roman commander, and Paul was taken into custody. The whole city of Jerusalem, we read in Acts 21:31, was in an uproar. And part of the commander's job in that day and in that time was to keep order in the city. So this small matter, the whole city of Jerusalem being in an uproar as a result of Paul having preached and taught the gospel, was no small matter. Falsifications had been brought against Paul. Jews had falsely accused Paul of bringing a Gentile into the temple. But here's the interesting thing. God had specific plans for Paul that would take Paul through a number of trials that would mean that Paul would have the power of the Roman military even to protect him. Paul had been led to Jerusalem by the Spirit. And so God was going to be with Paul despite all these falsifications which had been made against him. That's the background to the trial of Paul and the falsifications that had been made against Paul. And when we share the good news of Jesus Christ, when we share what Jesus has done for us, when we teach and preach the good news, we may be falsely accused of peddling inaccuracies or peddling a lot of rubbish. The gospel is a stumbling block for people. But we have to be faithful in sowing the seed as Paul was. We may be criticized, we may be falsely accused, but like Paul, we should remember that the Holy Spirit goes with us to our Jerusalem, to our Rome, and that God, whatever trials we may encounter, though they may not be like the trials of Paul, whatever trials we may encounter, whatever falsifications may be levelled against us, may we, like Paul, be of good courage and be faithful in sharing the good news of the transforming power of the gospel of Jesus Christ.